Hi there. In the previous video, I said that Chapter 18 was the last of the chapters on teaching language skills. Traditionally, listening, speaking, reading, and writing were seen as the 4 language skills, but our textbook adds this chapter, Teaching Grammar and Vocabulary, to the language skills list. Whether grammar is a language skill or not is kind of debatable, I guess. Some people even say thinking in a foreign language is a skill. Thinking in a foreign language certainly is a good idea to help you with your spoken fluency, but whether it's a skill or not, I don't know. Anyway, our textbook puts teaching grammar and vocabulary into the teaching language skills section, so let's just agree with that for now. This chapter on teaching grammar and vocabulary is going to be important for many of you because a lot of teachers see teaching grammar as the main part of their profession. Let's consider the theories of teaching grammar and how we can use those ideas in the classroom. There are no surprises with the structure of today's video. The majority of the time will be spent on grammar, with just a little on vocabulary at the end. I'll be trying to keep it as simple and brief as possible. Trust me, I'm doing my best. Let's begin by discussing our own strategies for learning grammar and vocabulary. How do you study grammar and vocabulary? Do you use word cards? Do you practice by translating sentences into your L1? Do you try writing sentences and ask a native speaker to check their accuracy? In class, I'll ask you to share your experiences about what has been successful and what has not been so successful for you in the past. Make sure you are ready to contribute. Language is complex. There's no secret about that. One of the reasons for its complexity is grammar. On pages 463 and 464, we see an interesting discussion of the 3 dimensions of grammar: form, meaning, and use. In a very simple explanation, form refers to the structure of a sentence. So when we are looking at the sentence, I like ice cream, we look at subject, verb, object. Later on, we are going to hear the word forms. Forms basically looks at the correct word to use in the sentence. Like, do I use is, am, or are? Should I use like or likes? Next we have meaning, which refers to each word's, well, meaning. Sorry, I can't describe it in any other way. Our textbook gives us the example of the sentence, that is enough. When we look at the sentence from a meaning perspective, we see that refers to something in a previous sentence, is refers to a particular state, and enough means sufficient. Then we have the use. Here we think about how our message might change depending on the situation, even though we are using the same sentence. So if we look at the that is enough sentence again, if a mother says that is enough to a crying child, she is saying stop crying. If a customer says that is enough to the waiter who is pouring wine at a restaurant, it means I don't need any more wine. It's highly unlikely I will be saying I don't need any more wine anytime soon. I'll probably be saying that's not enough. We also see on pages 464 and 465 descriptions of discourse, how sentences and parts of sentences work together, and emergent grammar. For example, how some nouns are becoming verbs. Google started as a noun, but is now also a verb. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into these two too deeply, but still make sure you read through those short sections too. If we become language teachers, we kind of have to teach grammar, or what is referred to in academic fields as form-focused instruction. There really is no way to avoid it, so you have to make some decisions about how you're going to teach it. You can decide to go for an explicit instruction, in which you show the rules very clearly, and you'll probably be using jargon like present progressive and past participle. You can make your class even clearer by using a deductive approach, saying to students, today we are going to study the past tense. Or you can go for an inductive approach, in which you add a little bit of mystery, showing some example sentences and trying to get the students to notice the patterns in those sentences. When going for an implicit approach, there is little use of technical terms. You're not going to be saying words like present perfect. A lot of the responsibility is put on the students to find patterns in the language themselves. Those who are fans of task-based language teaching tend to like the implicit approach. You can go back to page 46 if you can't remember what TBLT was. With a focus on form approach, teachers are working towards incidental learning. Often, the teacher will have recognized the weaknesses of the students and places in which they are having difficulties. Then, the teacher provides material that encourages students to notice what is going on with the language. This word, notice, is one of the keys to successfully learning a language. I often tell my students to notice how the language is being used. Challenge yourself to use it yourself, and then reflect on whether you were successful or not. Then we have the issue of giving feedback when students make mistakes or errors. We talked about local errors and global errors back in chapter 16. See page 381 if you don't believe me. When we decide to give feedback on errors, we have to make decisions about how to do it. Are we going to be very clear and give explicit feedback, or allow students to correct the errors themselves after a few hints from you? Table 19.1 on page 471 gives us a few ideas on how to give feedback. If you're interested in going further with this, you can also look at more detailed ways of giving corrective feedback, such as recast and metalinguistic feedback. Here's a slide I used in a different class, about motivation actually, in which we were looking at different ways of correcting students' errors. Have a look through for a few ideas on how a teacher might react when a student says, incorrectly of course, my birthday is on May. We saw that teachers can decide to teach grammar in very clear and explicit ways, or they can go for a more implicit approach, encouraging students to find the patterns themselves. Some people like the explicit way because it is easier to understand and there will be fewer errors. Others, however, prefer the implicit way, believing that you always remember things you discover yourself. How about you? As a teacher, would you like to teach grammar in an explicit way, or do you want to go for an implicit approach? Let's talk about your ideas in class. Well, now that we've looked at the ideas behind grammar instruction, let's look at how we can teach it in the classroom. Our textbook gives us 6 techniques for us to consider. First, we have charts, objects, maps, and drawing. By making the patterns of language simple to see, students will often be able to notice the differences in sentence structures and create their own ways of remembering the rules. Maps are popular for street directions, of course, but these days, mind maps are also being used more to help students create and see connections within language. Dialogues and conversations are commonly used in textbooks. The grammar point being focused on is presented first, then students can practice a conversation using that grammar point. Another option, of course, is to practice the conversation first, then look at the grammar. A third technique is input enhancement, in which the teacher makes the grammar points being focused on in the class clear by slowing down and stressing the important words. This helps students notice those places in the conversation or passage. A little more intense than input enhancement will be the input flood. As you might be able to guess from the name, the input flood technique allows students to see the form or forms being used over and over again. The passage on page 478, for example, shows the usage of a and the. From reading this, students may be able to create their own rules for remembering how to use these articles. In yet another input technique, we have input processing. The two previous input techniques can be effective, but they can also be confusing for students. They still might not see the pattern. In an input processing technique, teachers give a little guidance to help students find those patterns. In figure 19.6 on page 478, for example, the teacher helps students find the difference between present tense and past tense by giving a checklist. The students still need to do the thinking, but the teacher can point them in the right direction. And of course, we have left the best for last. I am biased in my opinion, of course. The Dictogloss technique requires students to listen to a passage and take notes. These passages can focus on particular grammar functions or just be generally interesting stories. Students are required to notice, guess, share knowledge, and I have found the communication among students is great in the Dictogloss task. I will admit, though, that if students share the same L1, they might use that a bit too much from time to time. If you are interested in seeing how Dictogloss can be done, scan this QR code. Okay, finally we have vocabulary. Whether grammar is more important than vocabulary or not, well, we could debate about that all day. There are four main strategies that we are going to have a look at. I was once asked by a student, what's the use in learning vocabulary? There's no end to it. Well, that's true. There is no end to learning vocabulary. That's why we have to do it. But just looking at each word once isn't going to be enough. We should be aiming to learn and review each word around 10 times if we really want to remember it. And the key is to do a little bit every day. It will be much more effective to study vocabulary 15 minutes a day than to do a big 2-hour session every Sunday. Then we also need to see the words in context. Remember, the meaning is important, but like the use part of grammar we talked about earlier, seeing how the words are used in conversation is vital. Third, vocabulary learning doesn't need to be planned. Sometimes the impromptu moments are the ones that matter most. In my own experience, I have learned many Japanese words through purposeful study, but I've also learned many words just by watching TV and reading magazines. If I notice a word I don't know, I'll write it down, check the meaning, and remember it. Finally, as my former student said, there seems to be an unlimited number of words to learn. Sometimes we are going to run across words that we don't know. Remembering strategies such as knowing the meanings of Latin roots, suffixes, and prefixes will help you guess the meanings of words you don't know. There are some good strategies on pages 483 and 484 that are worth remembering for you to try and pass on to your students. Our final discussion topic is still the same as it has been for the past few chapters. I would like you to come up with an activity to use in the classroom that will help improve your students' grammatical accuracy. You can use some of the ideas in the textbook, but as always, aim to make your activity as original as possible. Well, that is it for this chapter. It's been another tough one. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class.